Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm your host, James Splitsuit Sweeney, and today is going to be a conversation for the online players, and specifically online players that already use a database or are thinking about using a database such as Poker Tracker 4 or Hold'em Manager 3 and are trying to get more out of their stats, more out of their database overall. If you're a live player, this isn't going to pertain to you because you don't have a database, so you might want to take an off week on the podcast this one and jump back in the next episode. But if you are an online player, you are totally in the right place, and we're going to answer some questions that are focused on the database and stats, specifically posted in the Red Chip Poker Discord. If you're not already a member, you can join for free today, redchippoker.com/discord. Get taken over there, join today, ask questions, jump in the conversation, post hands, and discuss various poker subjects with all of us. So without further ado, let's jump right into it and start having some fun talking about poker databases and stats. Right, so this first question comes from Mr. Bolster. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that properly. And the question is this. I'm wondering at what point I would start using verse hero stats in my hand to note HUD. I have about 700k hands in my database. Do you think it's worth exploring how particular player profiles are playing against me particularly, or how would you recommend using verse hero stats? So to make sure we're all on the same page, a verse hero stat is exactly what it sounds like. It is looking at your opponent's frequency or tendency to make an action against you specifically. So if you take a general example where you're looking at your opponent's 3-betting frequency, that shows you how often they are 3-betting overall. But if you look at their 3-bet verse hero stat, that's how often they 3-bet against you specifically whenever you 2-bet preflop. So this can be very, very useful. But the thing is sample size is going to be incredibly important. And it's not so much the raw sample size in terms of how many overall hands you have on a player. That's good, but it's not great, because what you're really focused on is how often they are doing things against you. How often are you two tangling? If that's happening a lot or it's making up a large chunk of their overall action, that is very, very indicative and something you want to be paying attention to. So don't just look for a raw number of hands in your database and say, okay, I can definitely use verse hero stats here, because that's definitely not true, especially if you're playing in bigger player pools. But if you're playing in smaller player pools, you're tangling with this player a lot, there's going to be a lot more verse hero situations and opportunities. That's where you really want to start paying attention and considering looking at verse hero stats. And just in case it's driving you nuts that I haven't given a specific number yet, typically about 5,000 hands on a particular opponent could be a good starting point for looking at verse hero stats. But really keep in mind how many opportunities are coming up, especially if you're going to try to do verse hero stat analysis for very, very specific stats. Things like double barreling turn in position in 3-bet pots, or triple barreling rivers out of position on whatever kind of texture, because those are going to come up far less often. But things like overall 3-betting, overall stealing, overall re-stealing, overall flop c-betting in versus out of position, those are going to be things that come up more often. You have more opportunities to see them, and as such you might be able to do some verse hero analysis. So keep that in mind. And what I'm really paying attention to when I'm doing verse hero analysis and really exploring my database and saying, okay, I have enough samples on an opponent, I think I could really get some value out of exploring exactly how they are playing against me, one of the big things I'm looking for is how do their verse hero numbers compare to their global numbers. So if they're roughly 3-betting the same frequency against me as they are against anyone else, they're probably not adjusting to me too much one way or the other. However, if they're 3-betting at, say, 6% overall, but 15% against me, there could be something going on here. Again, always check sample size first. Make sure you really have enough of a sample on the 3-betting stat to make sure you can get a reliable picture on whether or not this verse hero adjustment is true or not. But if it is, then it's definitely something you want to start exploring, because they might be trying to take advantage of you pre-flop. They might say, okay, well, you're just folding far too often, and they're just finding tons of extra free, cheap, and easy 3-bets against you, and you don't want to be offering that kind of exploitability to your opponents, especially opponents that you're tangling with on a very regular basis. Now, if I do find an opponent who is definitely looking like they're adjusting against me specifically, especially if they're adjusting by being more aggressive against me, one of the things I start looking for is, are there any kinks in my own numbers, right? Am I carrying a very, very high fold versus 3-bet number, in which case I'm kind of inducing and inviting a lot more 3-bets pre-flop? Because one of the things we have to keep in mind is the players that we're going to have big sample sizes on are almost always going to be regs, right? It's not going to be the recreational player who, is playing once or twice a week. Like, that's just not going to be someone you get a big sample size on. It's going to be the regs that you're playing against regularly, playing against daily, and getting big sample sizes on. And those are the people that are going to be paying attention to you. They're going to be trying to find adjustments and exploits against you. And as such, if they find things that are incorrect in your frequencies, they are more likely to try to take advantage of it. These verse hero stats can indicate whether or not that's actually the case. So if I feel like there's one reg or maybe a couple or a few regs that are definitely making some adjustments against me, the first thing I do is say, okay, is there anything wrong in my overall frequencies? And oftentimes you're going to find something like, you're folding a little bit too much here, you're folding a little too much there, or you're not barreling enough right there. And those are opportunities for you to say, okay, I'm going to go back to the drawing board. I'm going to look at this part of my game, ask some questions if I need to, get some coaching if I need to, watch some videos if I need to, and really start to strengthen those things up. So that way I'm not an easy target in the future and inviting aggression that I'm not following up with. But just to reiterate, one of the most important things you can do is double check those sample sizes. Even if you find, hey, this person is 3-betting me 3 times as often as they're 3-betting the global population, check those sample sizes. Is it 20-something hands, 60-something hands that are specifically against you? Because maybe they just ran good in that situation. I mean, I've played sessions before where I'm just happening to pick up monster hands against one particular opponent. I'm not trying to target them in any capacity. I just keep finding myself with good spots to do so. And to them, they might feel like they're being attacked, and you might feel the same way if you're like, hey, this person's verse hero stats are just nuts against me specifically. But it is possible that they're finding good hands. So also go through those spots and go check them, especially if they're like squeeze situations and you get to see showdown in those spots. That can be very, very indicative of, okay, is this person just waking up with some hands? Not a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're finding a bunch of like crap in those showdown spots and those squeeze situations where you happen to fold and the other person continues, maybe you can start finding some things. But ultimately, really pay attention to that sample size. It's so easy to go overboard and draw some really big conclusions that may or may not be true at the end of the day. So verse hero stats, they can be very useful with a big sample size, but take them with a grain of salt, look at the whole thing contextually, use it as an opportunity to find your own leaks, and that would be how I would start. And also, if you find people who, hey, you know, you got a good sample size, you're 100% confident that yes, this person is definitely 3-betting more often against me, what's the first thing you should start looking to do? Probably throwing in some extra 4-bets and probably expect some really easy profit in the short term as they're waiting to adjust to you and see, hey, are you waking up with big hands or are you adjusting against my adjustment? So hopefully that helps get you started on how you can start thinking about verse hero stats. All right, question number 2 comes from Fuzzy Ferret 83, who asks, is anyone here good at making Poker Tracker 4 custom stats, since I'm struggling to figure one out? So since this is a Poker Tracker 4 specific question, I would definitely suggest checking out the Poker Tracker 4 docs. Truth be told, I was a big part of writing and creating a lot of the documentation for Poker Tracker 4, as well as some of these support videos within the software, and would definitely suggest starting there. Not to toot my own horn, but I think they're pretty good and comprehensive, and definitely a great place to start. Or you can also check out the Poker Tracker 4 warehouse that has a whole bunch of custom stats that have already been created and uploaded that you can download. I'll leave links for all of that in the description box, but that is an excellent place to start if you're brand new to this kind of thing. But honestly, a lot of people kind of shade away from the custom stats in Poker Tracker 4. One, because a lot of players just simply don't need that level of customization. And 2, getting into custom stats can be extremely tricky if you're not used to it. It can be a little too much like coding for those of you that hear that word and you're like, that's not really for me. Truth be told, a lot of the overall stats you would want are already in Poker Tracker 4, but some unique opportunities and situations will come up when you're like, I would really like to see exactly this weird specific stat, and those are the places you would check first. Now, one thing I would suggest before you get into trying to code a custom stat yourself is write down exactly what you're looking for. Think about what you are really trying to explore for and what stat you're really looking for at the end of the day, because chances are there are other ways to find it. One of the easy ways to do that is in Poker Tracker 4 to go to the view stats, then my reports, and then along the left scroll down and hit the more filters button, and there you can go in, click in the exact situation you're looking for, pull up the overall stats you want in that report, and oftentimes you can combine those two things to get the data and the information that you're actually looking for. It's very powerful, but something I would definitely suggest doing rather than thinking you have to code something from scratch, which oftentimes you don't. And especially if you find out how to combine the overall stats you already have with filters, you can just save that report, pull it up whenever you need to, and you're good to go. So that is the free and included option. If you're looking for a premium option, definitely suggest considering upgrading to the Poker Tracker 4 Note Caddy add-on. It is paid, but it allows for virtually unlimited customization when it comes to extra stats and custom custom stats at that. Also offers a range of additional features such as heat maps and spark charts and caddy scatters, which are essentially graphs that help you visualize how strong your opponent is in a certain situation. So if you're looking for something a little more premium that kind of saves you the time from having to code these things from scratch or ask someone else to code them for you, this is a great option. And the more often you play, the more serious you take your database, the bigger your database is, the more I would definitely suggest investing in something like that. So those are your options when it comes to getting more out of Poker Tracker 4 and thinking about custom stats overall. Instead of just panicking and saying, well, I can't do that, think about what you really need. Think about some ways that you can get that information in front of your face and think about how much you need to spend on this. Again, a lot of players don't need the level of custom stats that they think they do, and always check the Poker Tracker 4 docs and warehouse first just to see if what you're looking for already exists. All right, question number 3 comes from Louis Q, who asked the following. Question about adjustments versus player pools. I currently have a core membership, so if this is covered in Pro, please feel free to say. I often hear people make quite generic statements about player pools, which are probably correct, but I just tend to take them at face value. E.g., you can get away with c-betting more than GTO versus the big blind, as people don't check raise enough. So how do people go about making these assumptions? Is this just a case of playing a ton of hands at your stake and then analyzing the data in your HUD, or do people typically sell their player pool analysis? I play micro-stake Zoom, so obviously miss hands once I folded, so not sure if that will impact my data. Additionally, when people then move up, do you start with your assumptions at the lower stake, start with GTO assumptions, or go somewhere in between? So thank you so much for asking that question, Louis. There are a bunch of things to chew on, but just one quick clarification for anyone who is playing Zoom or any sort of fast fold game that does have tracking available. After you fast fold, your database and your HUD are still keeping track of that data. So you fast fold, you're onto a new table with a new hand. The old hand, the one you fast folded away from, all of that data is still going into your database, so you don't have to worry. Everything is still going to be right where you want it to be. Now let's start with the main question up top, which essentially is, what is player pool analysis? This is looking at the average stats and analysis of the entire player pool, every single player that you play against. So if you play 25 NL online, you're going to look at every single player within that player pool. So the person you randomly sat down and played 3 hands against, the reg you've played thousands of hands against, and everyone in between, and you're going to analyze all of them smoothly. So that is just the general definition of player pool analysis, and the way of doing this has changed massively over the years. This used to be a really taxing thing. You'd essentially set up an alias within your database and you'd say, okay, here's a selection of a ton of players within my player pool, or maybe just a specific selection of players within my player pool, and you would analyze the overall stats for all of them. It was extremely taxing, very miserable to have to do, and it's not really something you have to do anymore just because databases have come so far over the years, but this was a really taxing time when we used to have to do a database analysis like this. I remember doing this when I was doing articles to try to compare aggression over the years and just general overall stats for player pools. I was trying to do it for like a couple years versus another couple of years and seeing how aggression had changed over the while, and it was a complete pain in the butt regardless of the sample size you have. So it's come a long way, and honestly most databases right now, especially if you're using Poker Tracker 4 or Hold'em Manager 3, can do this very easily. But essentially we're just looking at the overall player pool and what do the average numbers look like for that player pool as a whole. So you essentially have 3 different options when it comes to doing player pool analysis. You can use hand to note, you can use Poker Tracker 4 or Hold'em Manager 3 kind of by themselves. There's some different ways to do player pool analysis there, or you can use the Note Caddy add-on with Poker Tracker 4 or Hold'em Manager 3. So those are kind of your options. If you already have one of those pieces of software, start there, do as much as you possibly can. If you absolutely need to switch over, you can always try that, but oftentimes these options will get you where you need to be when it comes to doing player pool analysis. So let's take a moment and kind of break these options down, just in case you don't have one of these tools yet and you're like, I don't know which one I want to focus on. Let's talk about how you might go about doing this. So if you're using hand to note, you can use a built-in range research feature, which is going to display player pool data, and that data can also be displayed on any custom stat that you create, which is pretty great. So if you wanted to know a specific piece of data about the player pool, you just have to create a custom stat. Then you can see the average player pool value for that stat as part of the range research report. The range research feature is very powerful. even though the hand to note software can be a little bit buggy, which can create some frustrations to say the least, but at least you have that option. If you already use hand to note, I would definitely suggest messing around with this a little bit, especially if you're brand new to player pool analysis as a whole. Now, if you're using Poker Tracker 4, I can't speak to Hold'em Manager 3 only because I don't have it up in front of me, but with PT4, you can go to View Stats, My Reports, and then start a new report, click All Players Report, and then click Finish, and then add all the stats you want to explore in that filter right there. And you can also filter down below as well if you'd like. I would definitely suggest if you set one of these up, be sure to save it. That way you can pull it up very easily in the future. And what you can do is down below, you'll see the summary for all of these stats that you include. So you can see the average VPIP for all the players in your player pool, average 3-bet percentage, all that kind of fun stuff. And then one thing I like to do as well is say, okay, only look at players who I have more than 1,000 hands on. Because chances are if I have more than 1,000 hands on someone, that person is probably closer to a reg, and as such I want to see how do the overall regs compare to the overall player pool, since it's pretty easy to play against players who aren't particularly good, but I also want to know how I can specifically tailor my strategy and frequencies to the overall regs in my player pool as well. So those are some things you can do for free, but if you want to go the paid route, again, you can upgrade to the Note Caddy option and do some fun stuff in there. So like we talked about earlier, you can create custom stats within the upgrade of Note Caddy, and just like the hand to note option earlier, you can look at player pool data for all of those custom stats. The issue though is within Note Caddy, the views are a little more limiting with the layout, since essentially it's a list of stats instead of getting a really nice customizable layout view, which is a slight issue. And also, it can be a little more tedious to build custom stats with Note Caddy as opposed to hand to note. So keep those things in mind. Honestly, for most players just getting started with basic player pool analysis, using the kind of integrated options within Poker Tracker 4 especially are going to be just fine and totally usable, but upgrading to something like hand to note can definitely be very worthwhile, especially if you're planning on doing a lot of aggressive player pool analysis in the future. Now, to start wrapping all of this up and really start getting to the end of Louis' question, which essentially is how should we think about player pool analysis when we are moving up, you kind of have two different approaches. So after you've done all of your player pool analysis, the first way of thinking about it, and this is the way that I use it as well, is to think about the default baseline strategy that you have. Where in your game can you get more aggressive or maybe fold a little bit more often than you would, quote, normally, based upon what your player pool is doing overall, right? And some of the biggest, easiest wins you can look for are things like steals, 3-bets, 4-bets, C-bets, and also double barrels. Those are some of your biggest wins that you can look for if your opponents are folding too often on average. If the player pool is just folding too often in those situations, very easy spot for you to, on average, tweak your strategy and see if you can find some extra aggression in there. You can also look for things like situations where maybe you should be folding a little bit more often than you, quote, normally should, especially against like river bets, that kind of thing. So there's definitely, it's not always just looking for aggression, but I always start by looking for aggression because it's oftentimes a very easy place to find wins. That's one strategy. The other approach is just to try to stick as close to GTO as possible and go from there. And a lot of pros will actually do that. A lot of players in our community do that as well. I totally get it. One of the things I like to do is start looking at how does the player pool frequencies and data line up with a lot of stuff we found through GTO solvers. And that's a great way of bridging those two ideas, because that can say, okay, well, on average, my opponents are folding far too often compared to what the solver says we should be doing here. And as such, the way that I isn't just by sticking to the GTO data, it's then saying, okay, well, I'm going to take the more exploitative approach to try to find extra profit along the way. That's my personal approach. Not everyone takes it, but that's the way that we can start looking at the overall player pool data analysis that you're exploring and saying, what can I do with this? And even when moving up, personally, I would still take the default baseline strategy that I've crafted at my normal game and kind of carry that along going to the next level up. Maybe I shade it back just a little bit, especially if I'm playing in a game where I'm making some really large exploitative strategic changes. Maybe instead of, a massive change, I'll make it a minor change, but I'm probably still going to keep roughly that default baseline strategy that I've built in my current limit, the thing that I've been winning with, the thing that gave me a chance to move up in the first place, and start using that in my next limit up as well when I'm taking shots, and make adjustments from there once I get actual data that says, hey, this is the way that I should be making adjustments, which includes more player pool analysis us at that next limit, especially once we get a big enough sample size. And by the way, if you're seeing the value in doing this kind of work in exploration, I would highly suggest upgrading to Pro if you haven't already and checking out the player pool analysis series by Coach Weasel. It is extremely good, very, very dense, goes through some of the stuff we talked about today, but in a lot more depth. And Jones is going to take you through the work he's done in his database with his data and show you the kind of exploitative adjustments he's making and why at every step of the way. And also discusses some bet sizing in that series that is extremely eye-opening if you're newer to this kind of stuff and you're trying to figure out what the heck you should be doing with this database that you've been amassing over the years. So if that sounds up your alley, you can always upgrade to Pro today, redchippoker.com/membership. Come on in, and then in the main navigation, once you're logged in and all signed up, be sure to go to the playlist and look for the player pool analysis playlist and go from there. Watch the entire thing. It's incredibly, incredibly good. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully this gets you started when it comes to thinking about your database and your stats overall. And as always, if you have any comments or questions, you can always drop them in our Discord, redchippoker.com/discord, to join in today. Thank you as always for listening. If you have any comments or questions, let us know. Otherwise, we'll see you back later with a brand new episode. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.